My name is Marion Fourcade, and I am the Director of Social Science Matrix at UC Berkeley. Our panel today, The Economic Consequences of COVID-19, is co-sponsored by the Clausen Center for International Business and Policy, and the panel is also presented as part of the Berkeley Has New Thinking in a Pandemic series. On our end, this event is part of our Matrix on Point series, a series devoted to panel discussions on important matters of the moment. Next week, we will have our last event of the semester, actually, a Matrix on Point devoted to climate migration. We encourage you to register through our website if you have not already. But before we get started, let me review a few housekeeping items. So the first thing is, please make sure to submit your questions through the Q&A feature and not via the chat window. We will use the chat window for troubleshooting technical issues. So if you're having any AV trouble and would like assistance, please send us a message in the chat and we will try to offer you support. Please also note that we will be recording today's event and the video will be made available on the Matrix website. And now let me turn to the moderator of today's panel. Pierre-Olivier Gourin-Chat is Professor of Economics at the UC Berkeley Department of Economics and the Haas School of Business. He also serves as Faculty Director of the Clausen Center, as I said earlier, a co-sponsor of this event. Pierre's own research focuses on global macroeconomic issues. He is also director of the International Finance and Macroeconomics Program at the NBER and co-editor of the American Economic Review. So I thank him for moderating the panel, and I also thank all the panelists, and I turn things over to him without further ado. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marion, and I want to welcome everyone to this panel on the economic consequences of COVID-19. I'm going to give a few introductory remarks and then introduce our panelists. Let me start by first saying, of course, that COVID-19 at this point needs no lengthy introduction, and the global damage inflicted by this pandemic, both the human toll and the economic consequences, is quite staggering. The recent news on the health front are very encouraging and suggest that maybe within 6 to 12 months, the pandemic could be under control on the health side, but the economic damage may well be lasting beyond that horizon. Despite an array of programs, mostly in advanced economies, designed to cushion the impact of the pandemic, some populations have been more affected than others. Some industries and businesses are also more likely to struggle to survive and recover. Lower income and indebted countries face specific challenges, as many of them lack the fiscal space to tackle both the pandemic and their external debt obligations. And finally, on the global stage, what should the US new administration aim to achieve to contain the economic costs of the pandemic? These are some of the questions that we hope to address today. And to do so, we've gathered 4 experts who will help us understand the various dimensions that I've mentioned. So let me introduce them in the order in which they will give their remarks. First, we'll have Professor Hilary Hoynes, Professor of Economics and Public Policy, holds the Hash Distinguished Chair in Economics Disparities at UC Berkeley, and co-directs the Berkeley Opportunity Lab. Her research focuses on poverty, inequality, food and nutrition programs, and the impact of government tax and transfer programs on low-income families. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the National Academy of Social Insurance, and a fellow of the Society of Labor Economists. And Hilary, you're welcome to turn on your camera if you want. Shebnem Kalemli-Oskan is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics and Finance at the University of Maryland, currently on leave at the International Monetary Fund. Her recent work explores the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on small and medium-sized enterprises and also on emerging market economies. Among our recent policy recommendations is a paper co-authored with Thomas Drexel entitled "Are Standard Macro and Credit Policies Enough to Deal with the Economic Fallout from a Global Pandemic? A Proposal for a Negative SME Tax." which argues for direct cash transfers to businesses implemented via negative tax. Mitu Gulati, professor of law at Duke University, works in many different areas of law and economics. He has worked on a broad range of topics, including contract law, judicial law, behavior, law firm dynamics, and the study of race and gender disparities. Closer to today's topic, Mitu is one of the leading legal scholars on the complex technical issues regarding sovereign debt pricing and restructuring. This past spring, Mitu was one of the leading contributors behind the Bolton Committee's recommendation for a debt standstill for developing and emerging countries. And finally, we'll have Maury Upsveld, who's the class of 1958 professor of economics at Berkeley and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His research focuses on the global economy. 2014-15, he was a member of President Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. And from 2015 to 2018, he served as chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. Professor Upsveld is a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Recently, he wrote a memorandum to the incoming Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, outlining a set of priorities to rebuild the global economy. So without any further ado, let me now turn the mic to Hillary, who will give her remarks, and then we'll follow with the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm delighted to be here today to contribute to this important conversation about the economic fallout of COVID-19. So I'm going to be focusing my comments on the context in the United States, and in particular on the who is experiencing disadvantage and economic distress today and over the past months. So in my short time to introduce some issues, I want to try to do three things. First of all is just to get some data out there, sort of how are we doing? How are different groups doing in the United States? Number two, a bit of a review of the congressional response back in March, most of the elements of which have actually already expired. And then three, what should we be doing next? So starting with the real-time data, just to take the long view of the monthly unemployment rate series in the United States, obviously the COVID-19 crisis hit like nothing we've seen before in terms of the severity and the speed of the onset of the crisis. What might not be so apparent, however, is the degree to which there's incredible differences across the United States in terms of how the labor market crisis affects different individuals. So this particular chart, which is from the Opportunity Insights team, gives you an idea about the trends over time in employment for four quartiles of the wage distribution in the United States. And what you can see by the purple line is that the bottom quartile here, earning less than $13 an hour, sitting here at the beginning of the fall, is 20% behind the employment in the pre-crisis period, whereas the top quartile in turquoise essentially has no change in employment from before the crisis. So there's incredibly unequal impacts of the employment losses. Also unequal, that I'm not showing here, are differences by gender. We know historically that recessions always have impacts that are unequal. Low skill groups tend to be impacted more than high skill groups. However, the COVID-19 crisis really exacerbated those inequalities in a much more severe way. And in addition, there are tremendous differences in gender, with women being impacted more than men, partly because of caregiving, but also because of the industries that were impacted. Also not shown here are dramatically larger impacts for Black and Hispanic Americans. On top of, or perhaps as a consequence of these economic losses, we see quite alarming rates of economic insecurity in the United States. The Census Pulse survey, which has been tracking various measures throughout the crisis indicates that there's been a near tripling of the share of families with children that are experiencing food insecurity in the United States. And for those of you who don't know that term, it would be answering a question like, over the past 30 days, it was sometimes or often the case that my food just didn't last, and quote, I didn't have enough money to get more. So we've also got increases really across the population, but very severely among families with children, most likely related to the fact that when schools shut down, about 30 million children receive lunches and breakfasts at school. So the shutdown of schools sort of create larger shocks to families with children. We've also got unprecedented increases in demand at food banks. I'm sure we've all seen the photographs and video of long, long lines of cars waiting in line for food. In addition, there's a number of other measures showing economic distress, such as 40% of children live in families that report struggling to meet basic needs like food and rent. To give you some idea of the magnitude of these and how they've looked through the crisis, this is data from the Census Pulse survey for food insecurity for families with children. And you can see, first of all, the dramatic differences in food insecurity across groups in the United States, with much higher elevated rates for Black and Hispanic children, families with children, compared to whites, but very high rates of food insecurity. And you can also see that the brown bar, which is the Census Pulse survey at the beginning of November, starting to show more elevated rates relative to earlier in the crisis. So with that sort of snapshot of the nature of the labor market, let's remember what we did back in March. So there were two very large congressional bills signed by the president. The first one is the CARES Act. And the CARES Act included, I want to just very quickly review 4 elements that represent direct payments to families. So that's what I'm going to be limiting my comments here to. So the expansions of unemployment insurance were incredibly important and included a $600 weekly flat top-up to everyone receiving unemployment insurance. That element expired at the end of July. In addition, quite dramatic expansions in eligibility for unemployment for groups who under normal state law would not be eligible, including self-employed, gig economy workers, and also workers who didn't have a sufficient work history to be eligible through the normal eligibility rules. In addition, a 13-week extension to regular state unemployment insurance, which typically goes for about 26 weeks at a maximum. And so there was a emergency unemployment insurance that was passed as part of that. In addition to the unemployment insurance expansions, there was the relief payment out of the Treasury Department, a $1,200 payment per adult and $500 per child, one time only, phased out at higher earning levels. As part of another act, the Families First Coronavirus Act, there were 2 elements sort of in the food and nutrition space. One is an expansion of benefits under our food stamp program or SNAP program, which basically took all individuals who were receiving SNAP and elevated their benefit up to the maximum that they would be eligible for their family size. Typically, individuals combining work and getting food stamps on top of their earnings wouldn't get the maximum benefit because it's something that's phased out as your income increases. In addition, critically, as I mentioned before, when schools shut down, a huge number of children suddenly were not getting lunches and breakfasts that had been provided at their schools through our National School Lunch and Breakfast Program. So states sort of scrambled and eventually implemented something called the Pandemic EBT program, which essentially transfers to households through a debit card the cost of the meals that children were missing. And so those are the 4 main elements of this, of the congressional response to the crisis. And sort of the good news part of the story is that pumped a lot of money out. The chart here shows from the daily treasury statements binned up to the weekly level what those payments looked like for those 4 different components of the CARES Act and the Families First Act. And the orange shaded bar is the unemployment portions. The green portion is the economic impact payments, the relief payments, the one with the big peak when Treasury pushed out all of the payments in 1 week to all taxpayers that they had direct deposit information on. That's why that was so concentrated in that 1 week period. And you can see that through the end of July, the vast majority of those payments, almost 2/3 were unemployment, a little more than 1/3 were the relief payments. And these food and nutrition benefits, which are the most targeted component of the package and on the low income population, were a much, much smaller share, which you can barely see, and it's here in purple at the top of the bars. So in the background, we've got the food stamp program, which is really reacting in a dramatic way, as an entitlement does when income and earnings go down, SNAP use goes up. So that's the good news part of the story. So then that causes us to sort of grapple with the question of, with all this spending, why are we seeing so much economic distress in terms of this food insecurity? And in a recent paper with Marion Bittler and Diane Schanzenbach for the Brookings papers on economic activity, we sort of dove into this question about why. And we concluded that there were 4 reasons why we're seeing such distress. The first has to do with timing. There was enormous delays in getting a lot of these payments out. New programs had to get started up. Administrative systems at the state level were overwhelmed. And some states still haven't processed all of their unemployment claims from months ago. Number 2, outside of unemployment, the benefit increases are rather modest. Number 3, participation is incomplete. So there's administrative hurdles, there's digital divides. The bottom line is we see replication of inequities that we've seen in prior recessions playing out again today in terms of lower skill groups who are eligible for unemployment not converting to getting it. So there's inequities that are somehow baked into the context and the administrative hurdles in the system. And then finally, statutorily, some groups are simply not eligible. So the undocumented population is not eligible for unemployment insurance. The Treasury relief payment explicitly excluded any household where any of the parents were ITIN filers without Social Security numbers. So that gives us some perspective as to why we're seeing these still dramatically elevated rates of distress. Looking forward, what should we be concerned about? Well, first of all, the remaining individuals on unemployment insurance without the $600 top-up, which has already expired, it's estimated that between 12 and 15 million individuals are going to lose their unemployment benefits by the end of 2020. That's obviously a huge concern. So in terms of the next package, the things that are at the top of my list that should be on the next stimulus package, and Congress continues to debate this, is we want a stimulus that can get to people fast, that is targeted at the most needy, and also contains state aid because of the additional requirements that states are having to include. That means extending unemployment with some weekly supplement, more targeted assistance through the things like SNAP and the EBT programs that are already in place. If we're going to have another relief payment, it should be more targeted. The prior relief payment was quite untargeted and added up to, as I showed, about 1/3 of this spending. So I'm going to leave it there, and I look forward to talking with the rest of you later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hilary. This was a great presentation, perfectly on time too. I'm now going to turn it over to Shebnem Kalemli-Yozgan. Shebnem, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me share my slides. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's actually an honor to be with these distinguished guests and speak at this panel. So I was asked to talk about corporate sector vulnerabilities in advanced countries and emerging markets. So I'll do that by starting to saying that these are my own views and not represent the views of the fund. So, okay. I mean, as Pierre said, we all know how unprecedented shock COVID is in its complexity and severity. If we just think about in the absence of any help, clearly this type of crisis is going to trigger many business failures. Many firms will be bankrupting in the absence of any government fiscal support. And when you think about businesses, although all of them are going to be subject to this risk, small businesses in particular are going to be especially vulnerable. These are the businesses, even during normal times, they have a hard time in accessing finance. And in crisis times, especially this crisis, hits services sectors very hard. And these sectors are the ones actually with a lot of small businesses in them. Now, when we say small business, let me just make a definition here. In the United States, the definition of an SME, small medium enterprise or small business, is less than 500 employee firm. And in the rest of the world, it is less than 250 employee firm. But no matter how you define a small business, these are actually very important businesses for the aggregate economy. They represent over 50% of aggregate employment and output in advanced countries, basically, and then even more than that, over 70% in emerging markets. So we do really care about these firms, and if a large proportion fails, this is going to be one of the most important scaring effects. And this kind of moving forward after the vaccines, the recession that goes on. Now, the problem in terms of understanding what is going on in this realm is the lack of real-time data. Unfortunately, this is not only going to complicate the policy action, but also policy evaluation. So what Hilary was saying, we did all this pumping up of money, but we still see all these struggles. This problem is going to be even bigger on the firm side, right? We also pumped up a lot of money to save these firms, but there are going to be two big problems in terms of the small firms, especially. First of all, in most countries, small firms are not going to file for bankruptcy. They are going to be liquidated directly. So if we just look at real-time bankruptcy filings, we are not going to see these firms. And in the countries where they do some sort of filing, the courts are just super congested. And again, it's going to be hard to track the extent of the problem in real time. And this is true for any country. And in terms of the global dimension, there's going to be a lot of spillover and spillback effects, because everything that I'm going to say about a given country, say for US or for France, is going to be amplified for an emerging market like Turkey through an international production network. So the issue here, not only about some sort of break in the global supply chain, which actually didn't happen to the extent that we were expecting, but it is more about emerging markets firms, especially small firms, hitting really hard because they are going to have two demand shocks, right? They are going to suffer from the domestic demand shock and also an external demand shock. And at the same time, even the supply chain is not broken, and these firms, emerging market firms, are an important part of the supply chain. They are going to have a hard time in being part of that chain because financing of that chain is now really diminished, which is the capital flows or the trade finance. So I will try to go through these issues basically based on two papers I did. Let me start with the paper on COVID-19 and small business failures. This is joint work with Pierre-Olivier, Veronika Penčiaková, and Nick Sender. It's an NBR working paper. So what we do in the paper is ask basically these two questions, right? The first question is, what is the impact of COVID on small businesses failures? If we take a wide look and look at 17 advanced economies, and then once we have an idea about the extent of these failures, can we somehow link that to the policies, right? There have been a lot of policies on the table, a lot of policies that did pump a lot of money, especially actually to save these small firms, and how effective they are, and what is the cost of these policies to the government. So that's what we try to do in the paper. So the challenge here, of course, as I mentioned, the real-time data, right? So if you look at this equation on the slide, the idea is, okay, so the firms enter the COVID crisis with some sort of cash flow and some sort of financial statements, and they have their financial expenses they have to go through in 2020. And then their cash flow is going to be hurt a lot, their revenue crashing during COVID. So how do we get this number, right? So that number is not known, and we would like to get an estimate of that number so we can estimate the extent of small business failures. So our approach is basically to have a model, a rich model, and have the model to tell us this cash flow under COVID. And the way to do that is to introduce shocks to the model, both at the sectoral level and aggregate level, because you would try to mimic the COVID shock, right? COVID is not a financial crisis. It is not just oil price shock. It's not a demand shock. It's kind of a bit of everything. So we try to mimic that in the model to get at this, heterogeneous effect in services sectors versus education, and like aggregate versus sector, and then see how we can estimate this cash flow under COVID. So that's our approach in the paper. And basically using data on the nature of the sectors and nature of the jobs, and combining this data with the firm level financial data, we do an exercise that by shocking the economy with these sectoral shocks, see what happens to each firm. Okay, so we are going to estimate if firm A is failing or not, firm B is failing or not, and aggregate those numbers up to the country level. So the sectoral shocks are going to be very important. And here on the slide, I'm going to show you on the left, the sectoral supply shock we estimate, and on the right, sectoral demand shock we estimate. The color coding works as the orange being the essential sectors and the black being the non-essential sectors. And of course, the trick here is that the nature of the jobs in a given sector. So if you are in a sector where it is very hard to do your job remotely, such as service sectors and mining, that means you are going to face a severe sectoral supply shock. And you see that the largest negative sectoral supply shocks are these sectors that are service sectors, mining, the sectors where it is very hard to do your job remotely, as we are doing now, as opposed to an essential sector such as water and waste, where there isn't basically any supply shock. Similar demand, right? The sector-specific demand shock is also going to be about how customer-oriented your sector is. So restaurants, entertainment, other services, these are going to be the sectors that face a serious negative demand shock. But of course, there will be sectors also facing positive demand shock. And here, they are all orange, they're all essential sectors. So this is basically, if you want to think about it, so I have, again, agriculture here, water and waste, but a way of thinking about it is also like, restaurant demand is down, but of course, online grocery delivery demand is up, right? So this is what we try to capture with this heterogeneity. Then we basically aggregate this up after we combine this with the firm level's financial positions. And what we come up is a failure rate of 18% under COVID. And that represents an increase of 9 percentage points. So obviously before COVID, in a scenario where COVID shock didn't happen, some firms are going to fail, right? So in that sense, the change is what is important, right? Under no COVID scenario, your failure rate is something around 9.5, and now it's going to be something around 18.2. So that's around the 9 percentage point increase in small businesses. These are small businesses bankruptcy rates. And it doesn't really matter if we use all our 17 countries or the countries where we have like excellent coverage of small businesses. We pretty much come up with this number. Of course, this is going to mask sector heterogeneity that I just showed you, super important given the nature of the COVID shock. COVID shock hits different sectors differently in terms of sector supply and sector demand. And the bottom figure on the slide tells you how drastic that is, right? If you look at a sector like accommodation and food, the increase in the bankruptcy rate when you compare non-COVID to COVID is, around 25 percentage point, as opposed to a sector like electricity, it is barely increasing like 1.5 percentage points. So this average 9 percentage point increase in the bankruptcy rate for small businesses in the aggregate is really a combination of these huge sector heterogeneity, which is going to lead to all those problems in terms of inequality in the nature of the lost jobs. At the country level, remember I told you we look at 17 countries. You would like to have really kind of this wide range of countries to make sure we are not, driving our results based only on US or only on Korea. And there is also a lot of heterogeneity. So here I'm showing you most of our countries where you can see in countries like Korea and Italy, the change in the bankruptcy can be as high as 15 percentage points. The increase from your non-COVID to COVID bankruptcy can increase a lot, versus a country like Czech Republic, it is not as high. It's only 5.4 percentage point. Why is that? Several things that's going to affect this country level heterogeneity, sectoral composition, of course, and also your initial conditions, right? You know, at the entry, the COVID shock at the end of 2019, how strong your firm's financial positions, how much debt they carry entering the COVID, and so forth. So that type of differences across countries, and the sectoral differences, of course, going to determine these differences. Realize that I don't mention anything about the government support. All these numbers are done first in the absence of government support, because we want to understand how serious this problem is going to be in the absence of government support. Of course, in the real life, there has been many policy programs on the table. And for our 17 country data set, it is actually very hard to do what Hillary did for the US. If you look at the policy trackers, basically the policy number for our countries is over 500. So, and these are just SME policies, by the way. This is not the policies for all the firms, but just designed to save small businesses. There are over 500 policies undertaken. So in that sense, it will be hard for us to go country by country. Okay, you know, Italy did these 4 policies, Germany did these 5 policies, like let us see the effect. So that's not the exercise we are doing, but we try to group the policies in bins and see what type of policy, you know, had a better chance of working, what type of policy efficient in terms of job saves and the wages saved versus the cost to government. So, and in general, the policies varies a lot, right? There are like these direct subsidies, like what Australia did, France did. There are guaranteed loans. Some of those are going to be 100% guaranteed by government, some less, like Canada and US. So there's a variety of policies. So what we would like to do is kind of focus on 4 to make our key point that policy support is very important, but it has to be targeted. So first, we just look at kind of, let's bail out everyone, right? So every single—
You have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I'm almost, you know, I want to finish. So we first look at, like, you know, let's save everyone, and then let's see if we target these policies, how useful that will be. And then basically what we find is if we target the policies, we'll get a much bigger bang for the buck, right? So we save a lot of wages for the dollar we spend. We find a fiscal bankruptcy multiplier of 1.2. And then the other thing we are highlighting is if you just waive financial expenses, or if you say everybody with giving like a blanket subsidy proportional to their size, these policies are going to be much less efficient. Of course, in real life, it's going to be hard to find viable firms, but then the way to design the policies might be that you can, you know, give the money now and then take back later when the boom happens. And the importance of continued support is important. Okay, let me say one thing about emerging markets, and I'm going to conclude. So 2 more slides. So in terms of the emerging markets, everything I said so far is going to be there. It's just going to be amplified. Why it's going to be amplified? First, there's going to be much more limited fiscal space. And second, the international production network and global supply chains is going to amplify the effect on the firms. So let me show you this slide, and then I will conclude. So this is a calibration to Turkey, but using 66 countries Turkey trades with and then receive capital flows. And what we did is basically what happens to the firms in terms of their output loss under 3 scenarios. So the first scenario, say both Turkey is subject to the same COVID shock and Germany is subject to the same COVID shock, output, exports, and imports crashes 20%. In the second scenario, Turkey only subjects to a domestic shock where Germany improves, because imagine there is a universal vaccine distribution in Germany. So demand coming from Germany for Turkish firms' goods improves. Still, it's going to be a big effect for both Turkey, for Turkey, 14% output loss. And the last scenario is now when Turkey improves, but Germany not, still there is going to be a big loss to both sides because of the import channel. So just to conclude, SME bankruptcies can be large in advanced countries. And so far, bankruptcy filings are low, and we see a lot of media that says small firms are failing in spite of government programs. This disconnect comes from 2 things. First, take-up rate of programs. This is varying by country, by type of program. And again, it is very hard to keep track of real-time bankruptcies of SMEs because of the reason I mentioned. For example, the US Census Bureau survey tells us that 3% of SMEs temporarily closed because they are saved by PPP, but 30% came very close to that point with a very large negative effect, firing a lot of workers. Most programs designed not as grants, but as loans, and that is something we need to think about moving forward because of a debt overhang effect. Now, emerging market firms are going to be affected much worse because of these international production linkages and the fact that they lost capital flows to finance those linkages. So the final word is globalization is going to work as an amplifier to increase the firm failures, but at the end of the day, it's also going to be the solution. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Shabnam. That was a very rich presentation. And I want to remind the audience that you can use the Q&A box to ask questions to the panelists that will be gathered, and we'll address them after the set of introductory remarks. I will now turn to Mitu, and I think the last comments by Shabnam about developing countries and emerging economies is a perfect transition to Mitu's remarks.
Thank you very much for including me. This is an incredibly illustrious group, and I'm more than a bit embarrassed to be on it. But let me just give you some little background on what I'll talk about. I'm a lawyer, and this is a session on economic impact. So you're probably wondering why I'm here. I've been on a few of these, and I always wonder why I'm on the panel. And I'm inevitably in the middle of the program. And I asked my dear economist friend, Jeremy Zettelmeyer at the IMF about this a few days ago when we were doing a session. And he said, you know, Zoom is very tiring and people need some time to take a nap in between the important speakers. So I just want to tell you, this is your nap time. And you can, before Maurice talks, he undoubtedly will have important things to say. I want you to all have a little break. Now, as a lawyer, I work primarily on reading contracts. I don't look at the big picture, I look at the little picture. I did have the misfortune of spending time in economics graduate school. So I do the thing that my professors told me not to do, which was I get buried in the weeds. And I operate ex post, not ex ante. When we don't have solutions to a problem, when we haven't devised the appropriate solutions to a problem, that's when they call people like me in. And so I'm going to briefly talk just about that, whether or not we have put in place proper solutions to what might be coming. And I'm going to draw on work, ongoing work with two dear friends, Patrick Bolton and Ugo Panizza, and this is work that builds on stuff that we've done with Pierre Olivier, and it's ongoing, but all blame goes to my economist co-authors. So you might ask yourselves, I don't think anybody on my panel will be asking themselves, but if you read the financial press, you might ask yourselves, you know, why the hell are we talking about developing countries and emerging market countries, especially in terms of the things I care about and Pierre Olivier cares about, you know, government distress, because this is the kind of graph you're seeing these days. In March of 2020, the outflows to from emerging markets and developing markets were truly scary. We thought we were on the brink of something like the Great Depression, dozens of countries defaulting. But at the far right end of the panel, you see money's going back in. Last week, Peru borrowed. Peru has had, I think, 3 presidents in 2 weeks. And is completely dysfunctional under most views, and yet is able to borrow on the international markets at remarkably low rates. Belarus, I mean, come on, there are a few more basket case countries than that, or Brazil with its incredibly bad treatment of the coronavirus pandemic. They're all able to borrow on the international market. So one might be inclined to say that there's no real problem, or the markets are solving any problem that you might perceive. Now, on the flip side of that, if you look deeper, there may be reasons for concern. Over 100 countries have gone to the IMF for emergency assistance. Over 100 countries, that's practically half the globe. Now, those inflows that you're seeing, they're a subset of the world. The markets don't fund most poor countries, and not even most emerging market countries these days. The markets fund some, but they're not funding most of them. And third reason for concern is that global growth rates in many of these countries, if not all, are going down. They're going to be significantly lower for 2020 and 2021. And debt stocks are going up. And so all of this maybe would be fine if easy credit were to continue. And we are all celebrating, I hope, that we'll have vaccines soon and things will maybe return to normal. But I think one of the downsides of things returning to normal for us, and I will leave the economists to answer this, is that easy money will stop. And if easy money stops from the Fed and the ECB, that means emerging market countries and the poorest countries are not going to have easy credit anymore. And things are going to be really bad. So now let's talk about what have we done in order to solve this problem. So the first thing we did in May of 2020 was something called the DSSI, Debt Service Suspension Initiative. And I've been working in the world of sovereign debt for multiple decades now. And I have never seen the international institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF and the G20 work with such speed. At the end of March of 2020, the IMF and the World Bank did a remarkable thing. They put in place this thing called the DSSI for the poorest 70 plus countries around the world. And they said that the rich countries for their bilateral debt, which is a significant portion of the debt held by these poorest countries, would give an extension of maturity. You don't have to pay for the rest of the year. This is remarkable. They have to be applauded. And the official sector said to the private sector, we hope you will give relief. And the private sector said, we love what you're doing. We will think about giving relief. And so many of us thought, this is fantastic. I mean, the world is just coming together. We'll talk about whether it did actually come together. So this was DSSI May of 2020. It has now been extended. It was initially for 6 months. It's been extended to the middle of next year. The second response, and this was the product of the first one not really working out, because remember I told you that in the first one, the plan was to ask the private sector to please give assistance in the same way that the G20 countries were giving on a bilateral basis. And the private sector said, yes, we think this is a really good idea. And then they said, we thought about it, and we make profits, and it's not really consistent with what our plans for ourselves are, and the relief was basically zero. All right, so the official sector went back to work. We need to do something new, and the fancy folks at the IMF and the World Bank had lots of expert committees. I can make fun of them because I wasn't on any of those expert committees, and my apologies to those of you here who were. I should make a note, since I've done a bunch of panels with friends at the IMF recently. I love it when they all say, as Shebnam did, my views are not that of the IMF. I haven't worked at the IMF, so my views are definitely not that of the IMF. But for God's sake, I wish they were the views of the IMF. Please hold such views. I would desperately like you to have these views. So anyway, official sector response number 2 is something called the Common Framework. It just came out a few weeks ago. And what does the Common Framework do? It says, again, rich countries will grant relief For the poorest countries in the world, again, they will give extensions of maturity, no forgiveness of debt, extensions of maturity. And bottom line, they will ask private creditors to contribute. I mean, the language is a little more tight than in the DSSI, where it was, we would hope private creditors will contribute. Now they will ask, but what the hell is this? It doesn't do anything from my perspective. Now, my friends at the IMF resist this. They say, no, we've done enormous amounts here with this common framework. You are exaggerating, as you are prone to do because you're a lawyer, you don't understand deep economics. And they say that the big development here was we got China to participate. And for the life of me, I don't, China seemed like they were willing to participate in the first place, but maybe this is a major improvement, but it is not going to help us to get relief from the private creditors. Here's the reality of a restructuring with private creditors and the emerging market world. Most of the debt, the vast majority of the debt, the billions and billions of debt, is to the private markets. So for countries like South Africa, Brazil, I mean, I could go on. These countries have huge debt stocks to the private sector, and they are tottering. And this is what the private sector says to you. We have very complex contracts, hundreds and hundreds of pages long, that call for individualized negotiation. This is literally what they say. All right? And that's correct. And they have to be negotiated on an individual basis. Now, if this has to be done, I promise you, it takes years. It takes years. And if we are in a situation that seems to be the kind of one that COVID is producing, I think we can't afford to wait. We need a single shot solution. So this is what Patrick and Ugo and I have been trying to work on in an earlier iteration. We dragged Pierre-Olivier into this world to try to think about these single solutions. That was when things weren't so bad. Now, in our view, things are even worse. So there are two questions. I'm not going to try to answer them in my couple of minutes because I really want to let you get to hear the more important versions of this. But two questions. How do you devise a single shot solution? And I'm assuming an ex post perspective that the IMF and the World Bank and all the other important institutions have not put in place an effective solution with the time we've had. And I think the answer is they have not. And once we put in place a single shot solution that will interfere with contractual rights, the harder question is the economic question of how much is it going to cost us. We did this once. We did this in 2003 for a single country, for Iraq. The United Nations Security Council overrode contractual rights temporarily, via Security Council resolution. It was cooperation, remarkably today, between the Bush administration and the Obama administration, across two administrations, and maybe Maurice actually worked on this, that enabled the restructuring of over $100 billion in debt. But could this happen today? I don't know. After the last 4 years, maybe global cooperation is not going to happen. But I am going to stop now, and hopefully we can talk about some of this in Q&A. But thank you very much for including me.
Well, thank you very much, Mito. It was very hard to have a nap when you were having so many funny comments. So I welcome your comments and getting us all back online. Now let me turn it back to Maury, who will give the final set of remarks, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. I'll remind you, put your questions in the Q&A box so we can move to the exchange part of the panel.
I was tasked to look at multilateral challenges from COVID, and I want to cover 5 major issues. I'll have to cover them very quickly. But I want to stress that there's many more things one could say about all of these issues if one were to stray from the multilateral focus I was assigned. I want to touch on international cooperation on pandemic prevention and how that looks going forward, international cooperation on the pandemic response and how that played out, international cooperation on the macro response, international cooperation on the economic aftermath, and finally, the US credibility in global agreements, which I think is critical for moving forward with multilateral cooperation, given the traditional role of the US as a leader and as an exemplar. Now, obviously, there's a lot about the pandemic response that conditions the effectiveness of the macroeconomic response. And a lot of the problems we are facing now come from macro pandemic responses that have been, in some respects, inadequate. But I won't really go into that aspect in detail. Maybe we can in the discussion. On pandemic prevention and multilateral cooperation on that, a good starting point is a very famous 1989 Brookings paper by Richard Cooper, who was writing about why it is that we've done such a great job cooperating on public health internationally, but macroeconomic policy cooperation is so difficult. And one of his conclusions is that it has to do with a shared epistemological framework. International consensus about practical knowledge, he wrote, along with shared objectives, is a necessary condition for close international cooperation. And there've been two challenges with this comforting conclusion in the current pandemic. First of all, this was a totally novel disease. It wasn't smallpox, it wasn't cholera. And there was a lot of confusion initially over things like human-to-human transmissibility. There is still a lot we have to learn about this new disease. And moreover, we live in a reality where even what Cooper called practical knowledge is more disputable. And it is disputed for political ends. And this has kneecapped some of the national responses, let alone multilateral responses, the US being probably the major example of this. What can we do going forward? It's obvious that the country reporting of potential outbreaks to the WHO needs to be faster and more reliable. And that will require us to overcome domestic political obstacles that have prevented adequate recognition within countries of these threats. One idea, and I think this has even been put forward by the incoming US National Security Advisor, is an enhanced system of global listening posts, which would be an incursion on sovereignty, but which might be more effective in overcoming international obstacles. And we might try to develop an international consensus on the independence of public health agencies and monitors, much as we did for central banks. The cross-border spillovers from pandemics are probably even greater than those from monetary policy. And so I think we do need a consensus on this. On pandemic responses, one of the tragic aspects of the initial response was the proliferation of trade restrictions on key items of equipment related to health and sanitation. This from Global Trade Alert shows the uptick and then the partial removal of restrictions on medical exports. It also shows that there was a unwinding of import restrictions. Many countries have tariffs on soap, for example, and these have only partially been unwound. We need international agreement on handling such issues in the future because the presence of supply chains create a lose-lose dynamic from these protective restrictions. The WHO's capacity in this regard should be expanded, but some repatriation of medical supply chains could actually contribute to diversity and a more robust system. The US should participate in some of the WHO's current initiatives on COVID, such as the COVAX vaccine initiative. The new messenger RNA technology that is embodied in the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines raises the prospect of a prompt adaptation of vaccines to novel viruses. And this is all the more reason to try to centralize and upgrade the reporting of novel viruses and perhaps the scientific response to them in terms of modifying vaccines. On macroeconomic responses, I would say that in broad terms and in the aggregates, the initial macroeconomic policy responses were pretty effective up until now in supporting incomes. Both fiscal and monetary policy prevented much deeper aggregate recessions and supported probably more rapid recovery when, perhaps inadvisably, there was more opening up. But part of the tension we're facing is that these policies were designed for a short pandemic, and we're having a much longer pandemic. Now there is a risk of synchronized premature austerity. At a more granular level, we need to know for the future what policies were most cost effective and what were their distributional consequences. And Hillary talked about her work, the Chetty work. To the extent that we can reconfigure social safety nets, as for example, Chetty and all suggest, this could actually be useful not only in future pandemics, but for supporting international trade going forward. And international trade is one area where I think we do need to worry. This relates to Shebnem's points about emerging markets, low-income countries. Even pre-pandemic, in 2019, international trade growth was slowing. There's been a sharp recovery, but only a partial recovery from the post-pandemic collapse. And this does represent a challenge for global prosperity, but particularly for the poorer countries that have been integrated into global supply chains. Higher debt levels prevail and will prevail across advanced economies, across emerging economies. The problems will be worse for emerging economies. I'll turn to those in a moment. For advanced economies, I feel we should not worry too much about this because conditions are favorable for debt financing for some time, and there is a need for more fiscal support as we get into this new wave of the pandemic. Unlike the advertised effects of the US 2017 tax cut, I believe that more fiscal support at this time will indeed pay for itself down the road. Now, in general, economists view the sustainability of debt levels as first and foremost having something to do with the balance between the interest rate and the growth rate of the economy. Interest causes debt to increase, other things being equal, but growth reduces the denominator of the debt to GDP ratio and signals that debt will be easier to service. Eventually, more taxes will be needed, but over the medium term, it's important to avoid austerity. For the US, the Congressional Budget Office predicts that the interest rate will be less than the growth rate of the economy out to the middle, out to about 2040, actually. That's about for the next 2 decades. And so saying that we need to have austerity now because debt is too high as we face another wave of the pandemic and as we face indicators of slowdown, both in Europe and the US, is, to my mind, relatively crazy. In fact, countries should be doing infrastructure investments that raise productivity in the green area, as the Biden administration has suggested, as Europe wants to do, but also in areas like rural broadband. We should seek a coordinated fiscal push across countries. There's a need to make domestic tax systems more efficient and equitable, and to prevent the activities of individuals, of corporations, in using international loopholes to evade tax. This is going to be very important in bolstering public support for international engagement and for global public goods. I agree wholeheartedly with what Mitu said about needing a better sovereign debt framework. But another challenge relating the emerging markets and particularly low-income countries is global coordination on food security. As much as Hillary's work indicates a food crisis within the United States, on the global chain stage, there is a huge crisis of hunger and of poverty. Both of these metrics of poverty and hunger have been raised by the pandemic. And finally, there are areas that are international public good vulnerabilities where if we don't deal with them, we will be in the same position we are now with respect to the pandemic. And I would include here climate and cybersecurity. We will be saying, why didn't we do something about that in advance? Final point about US credibility. I think this is a central hinge in getting some sort of multilateral consensus on the COVID response going forward, on the economic response going forward, on the global commons going forward. And here, the US position is problematic. The Biden administration would like a change, but it's become increasingly obvious that the bipartisan consensus on multilateralism that characterized the US since World War II has crumbled. The recent election shows that these fissures are even more severe than we might have thought, and foreign counterparts are really going to view any commitments a Biden administration makes with a lot of skepticism. How long will they last? Will they only last until the next election? You can deal with this through treaty commitments, but it's obvious that that's not going to happen given the divisions in the Congress. So the US weakness is darkening any prospects for avoiding more fragmentation and rebuilding multilateralism on a truly global basis. The Biden administration's challenge is really to deal with US domestic problems first and foremost in a way that might build domestic support for international initiatives.
Well, thank you very much, Maury, for this very sweeping overview. And now let me open up the panel, and I would like to start by giving a chance to the panelists. All four of our panelists have given very insightful remarks, to ask if they have any comments or observations or remarks for other panelists to start the discussion. And I would like to sort of to get things rolling a little bit. I would like to sort of pick up on a common theme, I think, that I saw in three of the presentation, and then Maury's presentation came back to that. There is a tremendous, I think, there is underlying some of what we've heard is a tremendous uncertainty about the economic trajectory that we're going to be in going forward, and some elements of that trajectory look perhaps a little bit puzzling as of now. I mean, we have fewer bankruptcies now. Businesses have received quite a bit of support, and yet we think that vulnerabilities are building up, and maybe we're heading for a situation where we might have a massive number of failures. That's on the business side. If we think about the labor market side, I mean, Hillary's figures and remarks explain how food insecurity and economic insecurity is already building up, and how persistent this might be is obviously contingent on how strong a recovery the US economy might have. Mitu's remarks highlighted that so far a number of emerging market economies have avoided having a situation of default, have maintained market access, have been able to borrow even in the case of Peru, and the fundamentals don't necessarily look that great. But that could also be building up future imbalances. And so that's a concern, I think, going forward, because we think that one interpretation would be that the level of support may have masked some of the reallocation that needs to happen in sort of a growing economy, adjusting economy to a new reality. But at the same time, we need to avoid pivoting to austerity too quickly. That would have dramatic consequences. And I think that was one of the key points in Maury's remarks. So I would like to sort of open it up with that and maybe let the panelists respond to that. Who would like to go first?
I have a question for you, Pierre-Olivier.
Is that okay?
I know, but you're an expert, and this is so. Actually, I have two questions: one to my co-panelists, and one that I hope you will help us answer. The one to my co-panelists has to do with your whether you sense we will have a change with the Biden administration in terms of their commitment to global initiatives like the ones that hopefully the fund will push forward. Over the last 4 years, from my experience with US Treasury, is that they were largely oblivious to the emerging markets and developing world in terms of their usual leadership. And it strikes me that it is sometimes hard to restart that, especially when you're facing huge domestic crises. And if it's going to take the Biden administration 2 years to restart, then we're already in time for preparing for the next election. So I get worried, and Maurice's comments made me a little bit more worried. And Pierre-Olivier, sorry to put you on the spot, but we haven't talked really about Europe. And before COVID hit, many of us who cared about the global financial system were extremely worried about Europe, and particularly one country, Italy. And it is as if Italy is miraculously recovered despite having bigger debt stocks and lower growth rates, and its tourism industry completely decimated. I don't understand the economics of this, so I'd love to learn. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mitu. Let me start with the question to the panel, and then maybe let Maury respond, or if Hilary and Shutdown, if you want to join in as well, of course.
Yeah, let me just mention one thing, responding to Muti on this whole point of emerging markets and how they can still borrow and like the vulnerabilities going forward. I would like to give some numbers here, because numbers are unforgiving actually. We have to separate the developing economies, those very poor nations that got money from the IMF and also from China, from the debt relief, from this emerging market group, right? So the emerging market group, we think about countries like Brazil, Turkey, Argentina, South Africa, Indonesia, this world. What happened at the beginning is there was the capital flowing out, right? That was mostly portfolio equity, and that wasn't that much actually. We kind of got into this panic mode, oh, 100 billion, too much, but it is nothing. If you just look at how much one of these countries need to roll over by the end of December 2020, which is like around 20% of their GDPs. Turkey has to roll over 170 billion. This is way more than the emergency funding went over 40 countries in Africa. So the numbers are so, if you get that 5 large emerging markets, the numbers are so big, I cannot think of any spillback effect to Europe and US. I mean, it has to happen because of exactly what you said. The lenders are private. Most of them are actually banks. Defaulting on that loan is going to hurt JP Morgan. So I just don't see how that is not going to, and BNP Paribas and Deutsche Bank, how that is not going to come back to Europe and US. That's number one on the private lender side. On the sovereign side, yes, some of them did borrow, but not all of them, right? So, and this is together, because if the banking sector defaults and cannot roll over, and the corporate sector, the government is going to take that over, so that everything is going to become government debt again. So this thing is for those large emerging markets who have like huge private external debt to private lenders, and those private lenders being in US and Europe. So that's to me also mind-boggling. I mean, this is a time bomb, right? And this has to be something, solved with cooperation for sure. That's what I want to say on that point.
Maybe I could come back to Mitu's question a little bit. I think on international engagement, there are some areas where it'll be pretty straightforward to re-engage without huge cost. And I think certainly there'll be enough skilled personnel in the administration to walk and chew gum at the same time. So rejoining the WHO, rejoining the Paris Accord, more constructive engagement in the G20, I think all of those are sort of easy to do. I agree with your sense that the Trump administration ignored the emerging world with a couple of notable exceptions. Argentina was one of those, and that went really well. I think there will be a more global focus, but there probably part of that will probably shift back toward Asia, where the Trump administration's attitude was to basically look at bilateral, very transactional, bullying tactics with individual countries. The one big emerging market where there will be there's a need for an intensive rethink in relationships is China. And I think that the China-U.S. relationship is going to be very central to international economic policy going forward. I don't think the Biden administration is going to roll back the Trump tariffs immediately, and frankly, I think there are different points of view about how to engage China within the administration. But all of those things, I think, can continue while the administration addresses some of the pressing U.S. issues. The first and foremost being to get some sort of further stimulus bill, out the door that includes aid to state and local governments. And what can be done is going to depend to a large degree on what the Senate looks like, what Republicans are willing to do in terms of cooperating. I hate to say this, but I think a lot hangs on the election in Georgia right now in terms of how this will turn out. But it's distressing to sort of see the on the one hand the incoming administration sort of trying to put forward some sort of agenda and personnel, while the outgoing administration lets the disease run wild and undermines U.S. democracy. Neither of those things places the U.S. in a good position to have any sort of global leadership after January 20th.
All right, so let me now gather maybe a few questions from the Q&A and address them to the panelists. I'm going to do that by sort of laying them out and then maybe going around and in the same order of the presentations and asking you to maybe respond. So there are some questions about, I guess I could lump them under, how do we do fiscal policy or transfers smarter if we want to sort of contain the costs a little bit. And I think Maury spoke about that, and Hillary, of course, you also spoke about this. There are some questions in the chat about, okay, well, how should we think about housing assistance? How should we think about investment in mass transit or subsidizing mass transit? And so I think these are the kind of questions that go towards how to do deliver help where it's needed and the various ways. And so Hillary and maybe Maury, if you want to comment on that, that would be most welcome. I think there are questions on sort of the consequences of what happens if we develop a vaccine, but it's not accessible to the rest of the world. A vaccine that needs to be maintained at negative 70 Celsius before it's administered. That's a logistical and a major problem for vast parts of the world. So what does that mean? Does it mean that sort of global inequality will be replicated or amplified in terms of dealing with the pandemic? And some people in the audience were raising that question. Barry Eichengreen asked a question for me too, asking, well, do we really think that China would be willing to go along with the United Nations Security Council resolution that would basically suspend repayment on some of the Chinese loans? And is that a realistic prospect? And also a question on closing tax loopholes, which Maury has mentioned. That seems like an obviously low-hanging fruit. And the question with every low-hanging fruit is, why is there such a low-hanging fruit in the first place? Are there practical or political difficulties in moving forward on this question? And I guess for Shebnem, a question that one would have is sort of going forward. There's a lot of concern. I mean, that's going to rebound on Mitu's question about Europe. Lots of questions going forward about businesses which have been doing relatively well, been very protected in Europe with the various programs that have been put in place, both businesses and workers. And there are now signs that maybe some of the vulnerabilities are building up, and maybe Shabnam wants to come back on that. So we have about a little bit less than 10 minutes. Why don't we start with Hillary and then go around?
Great. So let me take one sort of swing at the beginning question that you posed, and that is, how can we identify the things, what can we do to make our responses more efficient? And so the things that I've been thinking about that are at the top of my list to prepare us to do better next time. I mean, remember back when the CARES Act was being debated, and there was this, all this discussion around a $600 top up that's flat. That doesn't make sense. We should have it be more targeted. And, that whole discussion basically came around to the fact that the state said, look, if you want us to reprogram the replacement rate, which would sort of be the first best thing to do, that's going to take another 6 weeks. And why is that? Well, it's because states are incredibly underinvested in the infrastructure in their administrative systems. I mean, it's a real downside of a 50-state solution. There's real economies of scale in the administration of these programs. And, as many people know, the computer systems that run unemployment insurance in a lot of states is run off of COBOL, which is, they need to bring people out of retirement to come in and do that programming. So I think that leads to an obvious set of solutions around infrastructure investment on this. If we're going to do something on infrastructure, is there a way to build into that building up state infrastructure in order to prepare us to be able to do better policy next time? And the second piece of that isn't about COBOL, but is about data systems. So take the Treasury $1,200, $500 relief payment. There were an estimated 10 million Americans who were eligible for this relief payment, but didn't get it automatically because they hadn't filed taxes in the last year legally. They didn't know taxes, didn't have to file taxes. Those turn out to be the most disadvantaged Americans, but because Treasury didn't have their information, they weren't in the system to be automatically sent out these checks. And they had to set up a whole new portal to bring in applications for these relief payments. So those are the obvious solution to that would have remedied that situation is if we had a better kind of administrative linked data system that would allow us to do things more quickly and in a more targeted fashion, if that's what we want to do, which I think most of the time is what we want to do. And our sort of poor infrastructure investment, both on capital around the systems and on data, really hampers us from being able to do that. So those are just two things to start out this conversation.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Hillary. Let me turn it to Shabnam maybe now. And
okay, so corporate debt is a problem. Let me just start with that. And we don't need to project that out of COVID to know that corporate debt is going to be a problem, because we know this from the global financial crisis. And this is actually, we know it because of Europe, right? Europe did enter with a lot of corporate leverage and corporate debt to that crisis, different than US, where there was a lot of household debt. And of course, that was a big problem in terms of a debt overhang problem after the global financial crisis. Investment didn't improve in Europe still by 2017, 2018. So in that sense, the nature of the policy support is very important. So we did a lot of policy support, very, very important. Europe did the most for sure, but the type varies. And some of this policy support came as to the firm side, like direct grants or like, checks to the students, but some also came as debt. So you attack a problem by creating more debt. Now, I guess it is good to do if it was done more in countries like Italy, where firms entered with a lot of debt versus countries in Germany, it was different, where firms entered with less debt. But if we throw a lot of debt to this problem right now, of course, this is going to be a problem going forward, right? That's for sure. And so far, I think, we are not seeing much because these programs are still in place. Germany just stopped actually filing bankruptcy. You cannot now file for bankruptcy, right? So there's just huge support to firms. And as I said, if that support is something where the risk is completely taken by the government and there won't be any debt overhang issue going forward, great, right? Then the government is going to be the losing party. But if the risk is now being also put on the firms, then we do have a issue at our hand. That's for sure. So this is something yet to be seen. But we do know that it was a big problem after the global financial crisis in Europe.
Thank you, Shabnam. Me too.
So thanks for the question, Barry. That's the kind of question I want to ask you, since you are literally the leading voice on the sovereign debt world.
Are you a lawyer?
So, but here are two answers that I have based on my limited experience in what's been going on. First, and the background is this concern about China, which I personally think is completely overblown. First, in the DSSI negotiations, and Pierre-Olivier also was involved in these. My impression was China was the one country that was pushing for some mechanisms to have private sector involvement. China was dissuaded from doing that by the rest of the rich countries. They said, no, we'll get private sector involvement. And it turns out China was right, that we wouldn't get squat. So I do, as a theoretical matter, given that China has so much lending to the developing world, I can see that, there is this concern they won't contribute, but that was not what we saw. And the second thing is, from my experience with two very small countries that have borrowing from China, where I have friends in the debt office from research that I've done, people who call me and say, what do we do about our debt contracts? The thing that they said, and this may not be representative, was it's really easy for us to come to a workout solution with China. There is stuff that they want from us. Maybe long-term property leases or more influence. Now, these are things maybe we do not think would be good from some sort of geopolitical sense, but from a debt sense, China is willing to give them extensions of maturity. China's worry is that the private creditors in New York and London won't give this. So, I don't know. I wonder whether our concerns about Chinese participation are upside down. Now, if you look at places like Sri Lanka, maybe we're worried that from a US geopolitical sense that they'd have too much influence. But from a debt perspective, my limited experience is that they're not the problem. They might be part of the solution.
Thank you, me too. And so we're running a little bit out of time. Maybe Maury, if you have a some final remarks or a comment.
Let me just take up the vaccine question, which is super important because we cannot control this disease unless we do it globally, and we cannot allow low-income and emerging markets to remain reservoirs of the disease and think that we in the richer world can be immune. The EU, the WHO, government of France set up a COVAX network to develop a portfolio of vaccines. The US declined to join it. The US now needs to join and support that network. And the point of a portfolio of vaccines is that different vaccines may be better adapted to different parts of the world. So, for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford vaccine, which has had some issues in terms of its testing, but will probably come online at some point, does not require hyper-refrigeration to be transported to where it is used, and it's also much cheaper to produce. So that might be very well suited to parts of the low-income world, but be very effective. So I think as these, you know, the drug companies are moving forward with these vaccines, the challenge will be to get them out and to you know, match the best options to the needs of the clients.
Well, on this note, I want to thank again our panelists. Wonderful hour and a half talking about these very important issues, covering very different perspectives. Many thanks for your time and your remarks. Many thanks to all those who attended. And also I want to thank people who made this possible in the background. So Jessica Stewart and Chuck Kupelke from Matrix, Chris Bush from the Clausen Center, and Laura Counts at Haas for the New Thinking in Pandemic web series. And of course, Marion Fourcade is the director of the Social Science Matrix who hosted us today. Thank you very much, and goodbye everyone.